Welcome to the Radical Middle Podcast, where we believe the right solutions start with asking the right questions. With your host, Thomas McMurtry.
Hi there, this is Thomas McMurtry here from the Radical Middle Podcast, where we're trying to explore new solutions beyond ideology and find, the balanced middle. I'm really excited today. I'm joined by my friend Ian Hull, and we're going to have a little intergenerational discussion on the housing crisis, the development of the housing market in Canada, and how it affects sort of the broader macroeconomic trends of Canada. Hi,
awesome,
Ian.
Tom. Great to see you. And it is an intergenerational discussion. I'm too old to be counting, and you're young enough to not know a lot of the stuff that I know. One of the things is I'm a lawyer and you're an MBA, so we've got a good cross section. I'm going to ask you some questions to help me understand some of these concepts because I went to law school because I can't do math. And I want to just start off with just a little bit of an introduction about you and tell me a little bit about where you're coming from and what are we trying to accomplish today?
Well, first of all, I had to correct you. I'm actually, I only have a master's in economics, so not an MBA. Studied political economics. And I finished my degree last year, and I was studying ultimately in my thesis the Canadian economy. I was very interested. If you go anywhere, I was studying in Europe actually, and if you go to any major city in the West, it's the same story from young people. The rents are out of control. And so it's obviously a hot topic all over the world. So I figured I was hoping to look a bit deeper into the question and see how is this affecting other areas of the economy, essentially.
Well, that's great. And I appreciate the delineation because, of course, to a lawyer, it means nothing. It's masters in economics or masters in business is all the same, a lot of numbers. Okay, so one of the things I don't appreciate, because my generation in Canada anyway, enjoyed an increase in the value of their homes astronomically and quite frankly, embarrassingly in its own right. I'm enjoying it. I'm going to take the ride, but it's pretty unfair from you when you look back at this. But can you tell me a little bit about housing and finance and why are they a central part of certainly the economy in Canada and generally?
Yeah, well, one of the things that led me to my research was sort of that missing piece of the finance. It's really not talked about in a lot of mainstream economic models. And the real linkage there has been this huge, well, first of all, a coalescence between the real estate sector and finance. And it's led to a ballooning of debt, right? So actually, I suppose I'll share right now my just a quick chart just showing really what we're looking at in Canada in terms of debt to income ratios. So you've seen in the last 30 years here, just an astronomical rise. It peaked in 2021 around, I think, 185% of debt to income. That was the ratio. Pardon me. So we're looking at one of the highest in the OECD. We're a highly financialized economy. So about 80% of bank lending is directed to the mortgage sector. So there's all sorts of implications that I was interested in this equation to explore in my research. How is this affecting business investment? Are these banks able to lend beyond just real estate, or is that focusing all of our resources? And to your original point, that's kind of this idea of wealth. How do we conceptualize wealth on an individual basis? A lot of people, especially in your generation, have felt this is real wealth and it has accumulated. But we're looking at sort of how do we sustain this? And you can't necessarily just have unlimited growth in these asset prices. And that's where we see sort of terms like virtual wealth creation and stuff like that.
Okay, so I want to explore a little bit of that, certainly the virtual wealth creation concept. But you're so right in this. At one level, my generation is enjoying the cashing out as well, right? And so we're able to then put it into different assets, which may not be real wealth either, like the markets and things like that. But so what you're telling me is that it's the heavily weighted mortgage lending sector that is sort of holding up this value in my house? Is that part of it? Is it something that you're worried is going to shift away from that? Am I going to lose my equity in my house? What is this sort of where's this taking me as an elderly person in the game? And where's it taking you as someone trying to get into the real estate or into the finances game?
Yeah, I mean, that was also a very paramount question for a lot of people is how do we necessarily unwind a bit of the bubble we see? And that is a very complicated question indeed. Of course, it's very intertwined with pensions and all sorts of financial markets. It's one of the reasons it's been reinforced so much from central bank policy and government policy. And there's the idea there that you have accumulated real wealth, right? And maybe an idea that would spur on to other areas of the economy. You would, pay your workers more. The old trickle down idea. We'll invest more in businesses, perhaps, but we haven't really seen that as the case, right? So it's really seemed to be siphoning off resources that would be invested in capital formation in tangible businesses. So on the high level, I was led to this sort of question, like this simplistic dichotomy between socialism and capitalism is a little bit played out. I mean, I think we can all agree we really believe in the idea of free enterprise and people starting businesses, but we've seen just a tilting towards more extractive forms of accumulation of wealth that don't produce new assets. So when you look at that chart of the ballooning debt, what you see is that's a carrying capacity, right? So now we have to maintain interest payments, but those assets that we're buying are not producing anything to pay off that interest in the long run, right? So it's adding in this systemic risk across the board. But I'll show you directly as well. I have this chart that also framed my thesis.
Just before let me just break that down. We go to the chart. So what you're telling me is that I've enjoyed an enormous growth in my property unnaturally in a sense, and I've also hogged the puck. Once I get the money out, when I cash out, I'm not then pouring it back into the economy at the level that it needs to sustain growth and entrepreneurial spirit and so on. Is that where that's taking us in terms of the problem?
Yes, that's part of it, right? That's certainly part of it. You're enjoying the fruits of your labor, perhaps, maybe buying more real estate as some people are doubling down, not selling their houses. But the other problem here that I'm really interested in is how those easy returns have taken away, especially that bank credit. So when people are looking to start, like people may in the past have thought about starting a business, but when you just see the easy returns from real estate, safe, easy returns, especially for banks, it requires lower collateral, lower capital requirements. So it's just, it's been easy money, right? So people haven't been creative. We haven't been investing in infrastructure, and again, tangible businesses, capital formation, even the intellectual property products, we're lagging behind other countries because it's incentives, right? So it's not that anyone's doing anything evil or anything. The incentives are there, the easiest returns for the least amount of work, but that creates sort of a disincentive to invest in real sectors of the economy. We call it, real economy versus a kind of a rentier or virtual economy, if you will.
Okay, so sorry, I interrupted you. We're going to show us a chart to help us illustrate this.
Yeah, we can circle back to the that decline in business investment. We use sort of capital formation as the proxy. So I don't know if you can see it here. I have in blue is the business investment over time, right? So this is over about 60 or 50 years, going back to the 60s when this is from Statistics Canada. And you'll see right around 2000 there, this uptick in investment. And they almost overlapped in 2021. You just saw this huge boom also in Canada. If you remember during COVID, everyone had maybe a little extra income to take on a bit more debt. But there's just a trend here where you can see that business investment is sort of stagnating or declining. And that residential investment, so this is as percentage of GDP, has been steadily climbing, right?
All right. So that's a really good illustration chart to see the trending. So what are some of the sort of forward thinking ideas that you've got in terms of I get the problem. Do you have some suggestions on the solutions, or what direction, and maybe there are no solutions instantly, but what direction should we be heading to get to the point where people are not, essentially what I feel like they're being lazy with their money. And that's a history, right? We have Canadian banks that are safe banks, and we've had the benefit of safe investments, safe banking, safe investments, a safe country. We have all of those joys, but where do you see some of this, the impact of it in terms of moving forward?
Yeah, well, again, the solutions are definitely not going to be easy or pain-free. If I back up for a second again, because as a recent graduate, we're better at critiquing than solving these issues, very simply. But again, I think it comes back to incentives, right? You pointed to it, but we have a highly financialized economy in Canada. Some of the biggest banks in the world, like seen as very stable. Our pension system is world renowned, really. So there's a lot of stability that we have, but also that stability has been sort of propped up as well by government policy, right? This is where that difference between this idea of like free markets and government intervention gets a little bit twisted in sort of our present paradigm and neoliberal paradigm. I have a lovely quote I like to use from the CMHC president, so the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. He said, "We don't believe that heavy regulation is required in this environment. The marketplace will dictate where we have to go." So it sounds good. It sounds like, yeah, let's leave it to the market. But if the government is insuring all sorts and securitizing all sorts of and underwriting all of this debt, you're clearly changing. You're clearly impacting the marketplace, right? You're interfering in the marketplace and ensuring it and encouraging more speculation. So to answer your question, I mean, so the incentives are have been to asset appreciation, right? So these assets rise in value, and it looks good on balance sheets and in individual households, but it's not a sustainable growth model. So the solutions are re-incentivizing productive investments. So they don't sound good, and they might even sound rather radical, but you have to somehow disincentivize capital, our emphasis on capital gains and asset speculation, and shift the focus back off of rent, so rent extraction, to profit and business and investing in infrastructure and real businesses that will pay back the debt that they take on.
All right, and so obviously it's a complex problem with many elements and solutions tied to it. So that's a good start, the incentivizing, and we'll break down some of those ideas as we move along in this series. But one of the things I've sort of wondered, really, like, what made you interested in this question? What drove your you're launching yourself into the economy actively now at your stage in life? You're finished school. You're in the business world. You're in the business sector. What sort of drew you to this? What made you interested in this question?
Well, honestly, it was a circuitous route. Really, I was led to the work of an economist. He's sort of a pop economist named Henry George, actually from Leo Tolstoy. So it was a weird route. While I was thinking of what am I really interested in studying here, and Henry George wrote this book, Progress and Poverty, around the end of the 19th century, about how in all these big cities in America, it seemed like, the more progress or prosperity there was more like homelessness, and he was seeing a lot of degeneration. And so in terms of, he had a very simplistic solution, which was a flat tax, the land value tax, LVT. So this kind of circles back to your last question still, is we can eliminate his idea was that you could pretty much eliminate all other taxes, and put all of that weight onto land tax. And that would, this idea is, he was very pro private property, but the idea is that increasing land values, especially in a big city or any city, are not usually due to the work of any individual investor or developer. Maybe you make a nicer building, but it's usually because of the surrounding area, the population, the economic activity, the government investment in parks, schools. If you build a condo out in the middle of northern Canada, it does not have the same value, right? So it's kind of a communal value that increases these asset prices. So that's where you justify that land value tax. That value is really not due to you holding that, your exclusive ownership of an asset. So there was an example in Manhattan. They had this project years ago, the High Line, where they introduced beautiful park, and the land values all around there just skyrocketed, right? So that's nothing to do with anyone who's holding those assets. So it's an idea of that revenue should be recaptured by the state, and then we can use re-incentivize other investments. So what led me back to your question is when you look around, most of the focus on our economy is in sort of this in real estate. We call it the FIRE sector, so finance, insurance, and real estate. But ultimately, what they do is create a higher cost economy. So we have more payments, increasing rents, more debt payments, and it just makes the cost of doing business much higher and less competitive internationally.
Well, that's fascinating, because I know we see in Toronto they experience exactly that. We went from a sort of a what we call the poll tax, essentially, to a market value assessment analysis that the rest of the province was already undertaking in terms of their property taxes. So you're right. In Toronto, the community, the growth in the community, the benefits that are coming from that essentially get shared through that type of analysis. The last question I just then want to ask you is, what is your impression in terms of the politics behind value-based property taxes? You saw, again, not to be too Toronto-centric, but we recently saw the government in the last 3 years here, the new mayor came in and put a very high increase in taxes, I think it was 10%, and then an election year brought it down to 2%. It seems to me that's a bit of a manipulation of your idea for political reasons. But what is your view, though, in terms of how, if you were managing the value-based tax analysis that you just described, as if you were leading that charge as a political leader, how would you manage people like me who are living in a house for the last 30 years and all of a sudden we're getting hit with 10%, then we go down to 2% because it's election year? What's the management of, because obviously the big part of this has got to be buy-in.
Yeah.
Right? If we don't get buy-in, then we have people leaving.
Yeah, that's where, I can sound a little radical on some of these points, but if we back up, look from a little higher level for a second, there's a lot of discussion on how to solve these housing crises, especially in Toronto. And a lot of focus on the supply side. Let's just build more housing, which is, of course, let's do it. But what I was looking at is more the complex dynamics of the demand side. We're creating this artificial demand. We've been emphasizing homeownership and debt, taking on mortgages and debt, and sort of this idea of asset-based welfare, where your wages may not rise that much, but as long as your home is increasing in value, you feel more wealthy, right? But that has started to stagnate. But to your point but what a lot of those pundits will say is very accurate. We have very high municipal development charges. There's a lot of red tape. The city of Toronto is charging quite a bit for this kind of development to enable more housing. But I think our fiscal policy, this is where I sound radical, needs to sort of be, I think, revisited in its totality. I think, to your point, you have to get that buy-in, we need to re-incentivize in other areas. And I think that if you could offset that tax burden in other areas, such as income tax, if you could lower, say, income tax by 20, 30%, or at least for lower income households, you're releasing a lot of their burden, right? And then if you could shift those taxes onto land and other sort of monopolies that we have, then you would have, I think, a more sort of an economic boon. You'd have more disposable income, more aggregate demand in a Keynesian sense. So it's about, I think, shifting that tax burden. And that's where we haven't gotten there yet. We'll get there maybe in a later episode. Is the classical political economy was very interested in this idea of reducing that burden, that overhead of the feudal legacy, right? So it's very expensive to do business if you have this landowning class that extracts extravagant rents. So Adam Smith was very pro taxation on land because it's essentially very inelastic, right? People need land, so it's very inelastic, and therefore it's highly efficient tax. But back down to the nitty gritty of the city, it's a complex tax landscape already. So if we could simplify it, but also show people gains in other areas, I think we could look at sort of overhauling that system, if it makes sense.
That's great. And that's a great idea. And we're going to obviously break down some of that overhauling. So in summary, I think we've got a really good idea of the fact that we're heavily weighted in Canada on the banking side to lending against hard assets. And at the reverse of that impacts on that, we've got some sense of how to manage it politically. And I think on our next session, if we could talk about little bit more about, why might the allocation of credit really matter, and dive into what are the banks doing and what maybe are some future moves that they could consider as well. And then secondly, how have economists thought of this in the past? You've given us a little bit of that history, and I want to develop that a little bit further. So listen, it's been great chatting with you about this, and I think there's lots of learning still ahead of us, and lots of questions to ask and to consider in our next session. So great to see you, Thomas, and I'll leave it to you to wind things up.
No, always a pleasure to see you, Ian, and I look forward to it. I think we'll focus on the differentiation of credit and sort of how banks create money will be our next episode. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I look forward to discussing it with you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Take care, Ian.
Thank you for listening to the Radical Middle Podcast. Check out our show notes for further reading. For any inquiries, reach out at theradicalmiddlemedia@gmail.com.